Is your company really prepared for the Gen AI revolution? In this episode, I sit down with Matt Van Itallie from Sema, the company making code explainable to executives. We talk about the risks and the rewards of Gen AI in software development, the impact on engineers, and why private equity investors are already scrutinizing Gen AI code in due diligence. If you're in tech, investing, or are curious about the future of AI-driven coding, you don't want to miss this one. Stay tuned. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining this episode. I'm here with Matt Van Itallie. Am I saying that correctly?
Mhm.
From Sema Software. So, Matt, please, to begin, to kick this off, what is Sema and what do you guys focus on?
Sure. So we're a software company, and I should say thank you so much for having me. It's going to be such a blast. Sema is a software company that helps make tech explainable to non-technical audiences. When you're in companies, everyone and on the C-suite and the board of directors knows what's going on with sales or marketing or finance,
Mhm.
but code has always been a black box to non-technical audiences. And we were born 7.5 years ago to make code understandable to boards and the rest of the C-suite, even if they're not themselves particularly technical, while still bringing the same level of rigor to make sense to engineers and deep technologists. That's what we've done in general, and had the honor to help understand over 1.5 trillion worth of companies over the years, and give a executive level insight, kind of like taking your car to a
Mhm.
new mechanic to look under
Yeah.
the hood. That's what we do for code. And then for the last year and a half, we've been building a particular view of understanding code, which is understanding how coders are using Gen AI. And we've built
Mm.
a whole new technology to help boards of directors and CEOs understand how much Gen AI code is in their code base.
Oh, fantastic. Can you share some of the insights that you've got in launching this focus recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think about Gen AI code as a bit like Goldilocks. Too little Gen AI code, and organizations are leaving productivity gains on the table and also satisfaction for developers on the table. It is really fun under the right circumstances to use Gen AI in knowledge work such as coding.
Hmm.
Too much Gen AI, and it leads to some risks, and we can talk about those. But really, our job is to help figure out: is it too little? Is it too much? And if in one of those categories, get them to the safe zone for that product, for that company's stage and life cycle.
Mm. And Gen AI code specifically, Gartner predicts that 75% of enterprise software engineers will use AI coding assistance in some capacity by 2028. So how do you see the balance between efficiency gains on one hand and some of the security risks evolving over the next years?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a balance. We like to think a little bit about the analogy to open source code, which your audience knows is code that wasn't written by that team.
Hmm.
Was written by another team. It's a really good idea to use open source because why reinvent the wheel? But it's well established that open source code comes with quality risks, security risks, intellectual property risks. You replace open source with Gen AI code, and it's the same thing. That team didn't write it. An LLM wrote that code, but the developers prompted it. It's a really good idea for all those reasons, but it comes with security risk, maintainability risk, and IP risk. We passionately are believers in using Gen AI to code in the enterprise, absolutely passionate, but the
Hmm.
risks have to be known and they have to be mitigated. The best way to mitigate them is by keeping a human in the loop.
Hmm.
Code is a craft, it's not a competition. You need to have that subject matter expert engineer look at it through code reviews, through editing. And that's why, frankly, one of the things our tool does is look at how much Gen AI code is pure, meaning hasn't been modified by a developer, or blended, meaning it has. Blended Gen AI code is way, way, way safer than pure Gen AI code, for maintainability, for security, for intellectual property risk.
Hmm. It's really insightful, Matt, and it does bring up another point. In our some of our past conversations, you've mentioned this identity conversation, right? So the concern amongst developers about whether or not Gen AI tool still makes them true engineers. How do you think the industry should adjust this kind of perspective within the developer
Yeah,
community?
it's very real. It's very, very real. But I think there's an elegant answer. Maybe there's two elegant answers. One is, does using open source make you still a true developer? If you ask a developer today, they'd say, of course, my job is to help solve problems
Hmm.
with code. And it's not to just code for coding's sake. If there's a better way to solve it, my job is to figure out the best way to tackle it. Open source code is well established that as a core part of being a software developer. You still need, putting it mildly, to put in judgment to decide what open source code you need to keep it up to date to make sure it's applicable. But it's fundamental to being a developer today. We think Gen AI code is exactly the same way. Your job is to solve problems with the tools available to you, including reuse of code or pulling in code from different places. I mean, I'd say the same thing about
Hmm.
Stack Overflow. You most certainly are an engineer if you figure out the right way to pull in tools to help you do your work better. That's the, say, the modern view. And the quick answer. The longer view is, just think about the history of code over the last 60 plus years. My
Yeah.
parents were early software developers, and what they did, and listeners, if you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. They carried punch cards around mainframes that were the size of multiple rooms of an office building, all of which way less powerful than a phone, than the chips on a phone. And they literally fed in punch cards, and they had to make sure of the right sequence. And they would tell horror stories of the cards falling on the floor and then having to redo them.
Oh my God.
They were certainly coders, but think of the history. Punch
Yeah.
cards, version control systems, open source, developer tools. Over time, developers have had the advantages of more and more abstraction away from the code itself and other ways that make it easier, but there's still coders at every step of the way. It is still a fundamentally critical craft to decide how to put
Hmm.
the code to work to solve a problem.
All right. Let's move on a bit. Let's talk about money, the money side of the conversation. So you've noted in the past that private equity investors and acquirers are already analyzing Gen AI code composition during technical due diligence, right? So do you foresee Gen AI code compliance and transparency becoming a make or break factor in tech acquisitions?
Yeah, so I was a history major in undergrad, and I like to look to historical analogies because they make sense, and it's easier to see patterns that way.
Hmm.
Today, well, actually, let's just go back a year ago, at the beginning of 2024, um, any medium or large acquisition or major investment of a software company included an open source review. You literally
Mm.
couldn't do a private equity deal involving a software company or software assets if you didn't get an intellectual property review of open source risk, and almost always a security review for open source risk. Now, everyone assumes there's going to be open source, they welcome it, but they have to check for those risks. Fast forward to today, Sema was incredibly honored that some of the world's best investors and acquirers asked us to build a similar functionality for GenAI code detection during
Mm.
diligences. And now, all kudos to our amazing research and engineer and product teams. Now, mm, a disproportionate set of the world's best software investors check for GenAI composition during diligence, just like they
Mm.
check for open source. And so, whatever I think about it, I trust these incredibly sophisticated investors and acquirers who've made the decision that Gen AI code composition is important in diligence. And for sure, I expect it to flow from not only those leaders, but to other investors and acquirers in the space.
Very insightful. Thank you so much, Matt. Before we in this conversation, I always like to conclude things on a note for entrepreneurs like yourself. So, what advice would you say to other entrepreneurs out there who are maybe starting their own journey?
You can never spend enough time thinking about the job to be done and how the buyer will define success. And man, does that sound
Mhm.
incredibly obvious advice? But there is nothing more
Yeah.
important than understanding what is the problem that we're trying to solve, says the person who will buy it, and how do they measure
Yeah.
what good looks like? Because if you don't know that exactly as you possibly can, it's almost certain that whatever you're building isn't going to work.
Hmm. Thank you so much, everyone. If you want to find Matt Van Itallie, how do we do so? What is the best place to reach you at, Matt?
Yes, happy to talk to any of your listeners individually. You have curated such a community here. You can find me at MVI, Matt Van Itallie, at semasoftware.com, or any of the buttons at semasoftware.com, semasoftware.com is any of the buttons on Learn More. I'll make sure the messages get to me.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. Have a great day.